For the record, I just want to know who was it that authorized Pantera's performance in Moscow in the 90s? Who authorized that? It was a genius move. It was brilliant. That was absolutely the way that Glasnost was supposed to get into effect. I just want you to know I completely 100% support that. Introducing the people of Russia and the former Soviet Union to what was actually a very, very important moment in American history as well. I'm really sorry about Dimebag Daryl. I'm really sorry about that. I mean, that's still something we're dealing with here in Texas, including its role in election interference. How are you guys on that? Right? Because we actually were supposed to have some sort of deal to actually follow through on investigating the circumstances related to Dimebag's death and how that correlated with election interference in Texas. Did you guys finish your report on that? Did you guys get that? Because I got mine. But my understanding is I wasn't invited into this little forum to talk about that. Right? I mean, we can't actually possibly talk about trying to shut down organized crime syndicates, including ones that infiltrate the government based upon campaigns of murder. We can't talk about that until we pay for something. And apparently, whoever we're dealing with now has an expectation that somehow they're entitled to a level that they actually haven't justified, which is why they're calling on me, right? It's also probably why they're calling on you. Recently, it's come to my attention that changes to law in the state of Illinois connected to tax increment financing correlate with what were concurrently ongoing concerning obligations taken out connected to American companies and companies that were being formed in the course of the decommissioning of the former Soviet Union. There are specific timelines associated with announcements connected to obligations being assumed by those companies as part of the denationalization effort, as well as implementation of laws on a state level that had an impact on the actual city of Chicago. Now, my understanding is around the time this happened, Chicago was going through another transition in its own history connected to what had been occurring since what they called urban renewal. Some people called it urban renewal, but other people called it the Poor People's Campaign, which was when civil rights groups from around the country started focusing on poverty in the northern cities because the poverty that was in the northern cities had a different impact not only on civil rights, but also on other kinds of political rights and political paradigms than it did in the South. So as part of this, there were a great deal of political transformation that was happening and a lot of challenges that were occurring specifically in Chicago. See, it's well known that by the time the Poor People's Campaign attempted to launch and identify Chicago specifically as a major area where it was going to start focusing its political work, that there had already been an agreement that had been in effect for a very long time. Chicago had a system of restrictive covenants that had, by that time, gone back nearly 100 years, but at least for about 60 to 70 years. Certain areas of the city were actually cordoned off, and people that did not actually meet certain racial or ethnic demographics were not allowed to own property in those areas. These were kind of de facto, but there were also laws that substantiated these sort of selective decision makings when it came to who was allowed to own property, who was allowed to access property. And this had a very profound impact on the development of a variety of subcultures in Chicago. But part of also what it did is it highlighted the farce around the alleged urban development model, including in connection with public housing. And not only public housing as about providing a right to people to have housing, but also the way that public housing development, and public housing investment was used as political leverage in order to try to cow movements for political rights, including for African Americans, but not exclusively for African Americans. So, by the time that this change was happening with the tax increment financing on the state level, that was also correlated with what was going on with the decommissioning of the former Soviet Union. There was a period wherein the city of Chicago was terming out of a process that had been in effect for several decades concerning, I believe they were called community development commissions. And the understanding was that there were certain areas of the city that had been identified as being specifically committed to empowering and to developing resources for people that had been ostracized or had been basically subjected to the legacy of these restrictive covenants. And in order for there to be a new development in the area, there had to be a public presentation. There were members of the commission, some of whom were a part of appointed boards, but some of whom were elected or were selected by the community. And it also involved correlation with the local aldermen, but also other city agencies. So if you wanted to do a new development in these areas for a protracted period of time prior to the mid-90s, you had to have a public meeting. You had to pitch it to the public. You had to give the presentation. You had to talk about where you were going to put it. The community was entitled to ask any question they wanted, and your responses were going to be evaluated in accordance with whether or not they were going to accept that and whether or not they were going to move on. Now, I know about this as a journalist. I used to cover those meetings. My first beat was actually going to those meetings and observing those meetings and then writing about the proceedings. There are several real estate projects that occurred in the Hyde Park, Oakwood area in Chicago that were actually a part of those deliberations. And I was there to cover them as a journalist. I provided newspaper articles in the local publication, a community publication called the Hyde Park Herald. But by the time the summer of 1998 came along, that process had not been decommissioned yet. They were still ongoing. And so by that time, I had moved on to another publication. And at that time, what was the focus was a more regional or different areas of the city that were also having a specific kind of investment paradigm around real estate development. A tax increment financing program or the processes connected to the TIF programs were very much of concern to people in the areas because there were allegations that what was happening is it was entrenching the patronage systematology that was very specific to Chicago. This goes back to what had happened during the Poor People's Campaign. This goes back to what had been going on in Chicago during the so-called urban renewal, but was part of a legacy of identifying the mayor and loyalists to the mayor in a very specific geographic distribution of representation of the mayor's power, and then requiring demonstrations of loyalty to the mayor via performance of certain acts on the local level that were identifiable based upon your intercession with whoever the local representative was, in order for you to be able to acquire access to city services. And this is what they call the patronage regime of a former Mayor Richard Daley. This was something that had been very much entrenched into the community. And part of what happened was that during this time frame, within certain communities of specifically African American communities, but not exclusively, specific individuals were given a sort of leeway, a sort of priority, access to the mayor, proportionate to the access the rest of the people from the community had. And so what started happening is there started being allowed permissibility for very selective access by specific individuals within those communities to areas they had previously been restricted from accessing, with the understanding that they would do what they needed to do locally within their own area, to keep people in line at least enough to not actually be able to acquire the political capability to challenge the status quo, the machine. And this was part of what was confronting people when they were attempting to discuss within Chicago its role within a larger political movement, and were attempting to organize for that political movement. Now, there's been a lot of revisionism that's happened in the last 10 years regarding that particular part of the history of Chicago. And what's also been, it seems, subjected to significant revisionism is the role of that specific democratic community operationalization of power when it came to determining who was allowed to invest in the community and under what pretext. They don't have that specific manner of determination when it comes to real estate development in Chicago. My understanding is it was part of a charter that had actually been legislated, or rather had actually been effected through ordinance by the city that had a finite period of time. And then the understanding was that after it turned out, there was potentially an option to renew or to reconfigure it. But the history of that process and what ended up happening with those commissions and the records of those commissions when I was in Chicago in 2016 were nowhere present. And in the stead of that, there is the concurrent process that has to do with the plan for transformation. Now, we can't talk about the Chicago Housing Authority plan for transformation in a vacuum as if it's only about public housing, because there were changes to actual real estate law in Chicago around the 90s that also started creating these situations connected to these minimum requirements for so-called affordable housing. And understanding was that if you had a new development, that you had to set aside a certain percentage of your housing to be considered what would be affordable. And as part of the affordable housing requirement, there were also programs, including programs that connected with federal programs, to make certain kinds of subsidies and certain kinds of supports available, especially for first home buyers. But what was going on, it was already known to be going on in the 90s, around the time they were implementing certain stages of this plan for transformation, which originally was supposed to be 10 years. What was happening was people were specifically strategically organizing and coordinating individuals that qualified for the first-time home buyer exception to be availed of the advantages, letting them come into the development in order to participate in what was mandated as being required for the affordable housing component of that mixed income development, and then sitting on it for a year. And after a year, they made some sort of investment, including in connection with having access to some other program that subsidized that investment or gave them a grant for that investment. And then they sold the house for either market rate or in some cases above market rate. They flipped it. And then once they flipped it and they sold it, the developer had already met their requirements around affordable housing, even though practically speaking, they weren't providing affordable housing anymore. This is just one indication of what was going on around that time. And it wasn't just about residential housing. And it wasn't just about real estate involving neighborhoods that had been underinvested in. It also had to do with commercial real estate, including some very prime spots. Now, I think that that is what you wanted as a foundation, right? This is the kind of discussion you were hoping for, the sort of quality. How do you like my vocal tone? Is it a little too bass? Would you like for it? I don't know how to say it with a different tone. This is the tone it's supposed to be set in. How do you like the makeup? Do you want me to turn the Joker right side up? Yeah, that's not going to happen yet, right? Right? It hasn't happened for, 25 years?